Yes, most people when I say I'm 62, they get quite surprised, and they say, you don't look 62. I really believe, in my case, that it was due to the fact that inside, in my heart, I always believed I was young. Right up to a few years ago, I had an attitude that I was young. I behaved as young. I kept my social life mostly with young people, and even now some people, young people who are maybe the age of 20 or 25, they will say Brother Haq rather than Uncle Haq. Anybody else at my age will be called Uncle Haq. So I think it's an attitude of mind really that makes quite a difference in your physical appearance and in your outlook. My name is Haq Nawaz Ghani. I was born in Rawalpindi, which is the northwest of Pakistan. I did, I think, the first 3 years of primary in Pakistan. But then my granduncle, who had been living here, had been back to Pakistan, and when he came back here, I came with him at that time. That was, I think I was about the age of 7 or 8 when I came here. My parents were back home. I stayed here with my granduncle. My uncle was also here, so I lived in both households at different times of the week. It was good. I did miss my parents, obviously, especially when I was first here. I was very, very young, and living in a household which is not your own family's does have its challenges. But I have to say, generally speaking, I was very well looked after, and I was made to feel part of the family. As I said, there were challenges, but I think those challenges were perhaps instrumental in me taking the direction of life that I did take later on in a positive way. When I came here, I remember my uncle and most of his friends used to do selling out of a suitcase. They would buy clothes, mostly ladies' clothing, from warehouses here, which were mostly in the south side, and then they would put them in a suitcase and they would take a bus to a locality outside of Glasgow, and they would spend the day going from door to door, selling stuff. And people, very, very, very good. Scottish people are wonderful hosts, very kind, very generous people, and where every house they went to, they would be offered a cup of tea and some snacks, etc. And they would come back in the evening, and I remember in the old mosque that we used to have in Oxford Street, is it 27? I think it's 27 Oxford Street, on the first floor, that in the evening you would see these people coming there. They would come directly from work, take a bus, they would take a bus back to the mosque, not to home, to the mosque. And then they would take out off their outer clothing, and underneath they would have their kurta and shalwar, and they would do their prayer, and they would sit there and we would talk about how their day had gone. Many of the people who came to the mosque, they were in the same sort of employment. So to us, or to me, what was really interesting was the fact that instead of going home after such a hard day's work, they felt much more comfortable in the mosque, and they treated the mosque as a home from home in that sense. And they would come into the mosque, they would take their coats and jackets off, and underneath their trousers they would have the shalwar, and on the top they'd have the kurta, and they would do their wuzu, and they would do their prayer, and they would sit and discuss how the day had gone. And they had a wonderful time. They were all happy, although the jobs are menial, but the environment is very good. Wherever they went, they were looked on as guests, as well as people providing a service, and treated very, very well. And I wouldn't say this is unique to Scottish people, but it is something which really brings out special quality of the Scottish people, which is this being an extremely good host, very similar to people in Pakistan in the northwest frontier area. Very, very similar and a wonderful quality. I would say I was very fortunate very early on when we had this one mosque in Glasgow at Oxford Street. Myself and youngsters of my age, we were extremely lucky that we had certain people living here who made it their mission to try and guide Muslim youth into the right direction. They spent their time and their money and their effort with us to try and make us into useful Muslims, and it had some effect on quite a lot of us. Therefore, from an early age, my identity primarily has been as a Muslim. We had the first, I would perhaps say, the first youth organization in the UK. It was again thanks to those brothers who took this mission to guide us. We formed an organization called the Young Muslim League, and we had regular meetings. We had in 27 Oxford Street, thanks to these brothers, we had table tennis tables, we had carrom board, and we used to meet there regularly and enjoy those games, but also we used to learn from these elders, some of whom were from Egypt and some from the Far East in Malaysia. So we had these facilities, but we also used to, in those times, write, publish and print a magazine. And in those days you didn't have electronic media, so we actually used to type it on a typewriter. We cyclostyle it on a hand-wound cyclostyling machine, and then we would put it together and staple it by hand. That magazine went as far as Africa and France and Canada in those days. And we had some people who were affiliated in places like London. So that magazine created an identity and knowledge about this Young Muslim League in many, many far-off places. It was pioneering days, and I think that that perhaps at that time would have been a very important basis for the following youth movements that sprung up in the UK. Unfortunately, I think the real role models have disappeared. Those were professional people. They were not imams. We don't have now professional people who are involved enough in society with the youngsters for whom they can become role models. We now have a concept of, for instance, youth now. It is an understood concept that only youth can guide youth, which ends up in some cases as the blind leading the blind. The concept of generation gap, which is an artificially created concept, is so dangerous and so destructive. It makes elders understand that they can't understand the youngsters, and the youngsters are useless. It makes the youngsters understand the elders don't understand them and they're useless. It creates this, unfortunately, a gap of understanding, or rather a gap of misunderstanding, which means that the elders will carry on in an activity which they think is Islamic in their own elder area. The youngsters will carry on in their understanding something which will be quite different from what the elders are thinking. And you will have a gap of understanding. And two groups which are supposedly following the same aim will many times, or quite often, they'll be working against each other. So we have taken these things on which are foreign to our understanding and foreign to the way that communities have successfully walked in history. And our own history as Muslims, we know that in the history where Islam was at the pinnacle of its power, there were youngsters leading elders, and there was elders leading youngsters, and they were always working together. There was never been a situation where youngsters walked separately and elders walked separately. Quite often we have wonderful people living amidst us who have done amazing things, but because we have not charted their journey, all that expertise, all that capability, all that positivity is lost for the future. In this way, by putting it down into accessible material and media, that skill, that knowledge, that role modeling is available for posterity, and it can help to inspire people in the future to learn from the past, to move on to bigger and better things in the future.